Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a moment in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 where something extraordinary happens. Not extraordinary in the way of a Space Marine chapter making a last stand, or a Primarch returning from 10,000 years of exile, or even a God Emperor holding the fate of the galaxy together through sheer force of will and agony on a golden throne. This is extraordinary in a different way, a quieter way, almost terrifyingly quiet actually, given the scale of what occurs. A world burns with daemonic fire, 4 greater demons, 1 for each of the Chaos gods, the mightiest individual servants of the ruinous powers short of the gods themselves, tear through the veil between worlds and descend upon a cathedral planet expecting carnage and conquest. They get neither, because already on that world, swarming across its consecrated ground like a living tide of chitin and claw and biological malice, are the Tyranids. And the Tyranids do not fight the way demons expect anything to fight. They do not feel fear. They do not feel rage. They feel nothing at all. And in the silence of that emptiness, something monstrous happens. The demons begin to lose. This is the story of that battle, and it is also, in the widest sense, the story of what might be the most important conflict in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. Because the Tyranids and the Chaos Gods are not just 2 dangerous factions fighting over territory. They are, at a fundamental level, 2 incompatible forces of nature on a collision course. One needs the galaxy to be alive, screaming, suffering, hoping, fearing and feeling. The other needs the galaxy to be consumed. I'm stripped, silenced and still. Only one of them can get what they want. And the scary part, the part that keeps Inquisitors awake in cold sweats, is that the Tyranids might actually be winning. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us walk through all of it from the very beginning. Part 1. The hunger that came from nowhere. To understand why the confrontation between Tyranids and Chaos matters so much, you first have to understand what the Tyranids actually are. And the honest answer is that they are unlike anything else in the setting. There is no parallel. There is no analog. They did not come from this galaxy. They did not grow here, evolve here, or develop alongside humanity, and the Elder, and the Orcs, and all the other species that have been fighting and dying across the Milky Way for millions of years. Or should the Tyranids arrived from outside? Specifically, they emerged from the intergalactic void, the vast, lightless emptiness between the Milky Way and whatever lies beyond. They came from so far away, traveling for so long, that by the time their advanced tendrils reached the eastern fringe of our galaxy in around 745 Meshems 41, they had been traveling through the cold and dark for tens of thousands of years at minimum. Some scholars believe they have been drifting through the void between galaxies for far longer than that. Some believe they have already consumed dozens of galaxies, perhaps hundreds, before turning their attention to ours. The evidence for this unsettling theory is the simple fact of geography. The different major Tyranid hive fleets, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and others, did not arrive from the same direction. They came from different vectors, approaching the Milky Way from different angles of the galactic periphery, as if they had spread out in all directions long ago and were now converging from multiple sides simultaneously. If they all originated in the same place, they would not approach from so many different directions. The implication is that the hive mind, this vast and alien collective consciousness that directs every Tyranid in existence, has been conducting this kind of operation across multiple galaxies, consuming, expanding, and sending new tendrils outward in every direction for an immeasurable span of cosmic time. The different major hive fleets' approaches from different directions is worth sitting with for a moment, because it has a deeply unsettling implication. When the Imperium first encountered Hive Fleet Behemoth, what they thought, hoped, perhaps, that this was it. One fleet, large and terrible, coming from one direction. If they could stop it, the threat would be over. Then Kraken came from another direction, then Leviathan from another, and then the scholars began looking at the trajectory of each fleet, and realizing that none of them were coming from the same source. They were not branches of a single advancing column. They were vectors converging on the Milky Way from all around it. The only way you get that kind of spatial distribution from a biological species is if the species has been moving outward in all directions for a very, very long time. The Tyranids did not travel from one galaxy and arrive here. They appear to have spread across an entire region of intergalactic space, consuming everything as they went. And the Milky Way is simply the latest meal that happened to attract their notice when a psychic signal reached them at the right moment. What drew them to the Milky Way specifically traces back to a moment of terrible irony during the Horus Heresy in the 31st Millennium. On a world called Sotha, loyalist forces defending a remarkable device known as the Pharos, a piece of Necron-built psychic technology used as a navigation beacon, were forced into a desperate act. To prevent the Night Lords from seizing the device, an Iron Warriors officer named Barabbas d'Antioch overloaded it in a suicidal act of sabotage. The resulting psychic explosion was of sufficient magnitude that it reverberated not just across the galaxy, but outward into the intergalactic void, sending a beacon of psychic light screaming into the darkness between stars. And somewhere out there in that darkness, dormant Tyranid organisms registered the signal. The hive mind, whatever fraction of it was within range, turned its attention toward the Milky Way. It took nearly 10,000 standard years for the first major fleet to arrive, traveling at superluminal speeds using biological gravity manipulation, never entering the warp, never surfacing in the realm of chaos at all. But arrive they did, and they came hungry. The nature of the Tyranid species itself is worth dwelling on, because it explains so much of what follows. Every single Tyranid organism is part of a collective. There is no individual. There is no ego, no ambition, no personal history, no private thought. Every creature from the smallest ripper, those chitinous, the fang-filled little things that swarm over bodies and consume everything down to the bone, to the largest bio-titan stands in constant psychic communion with the hive mind. A vast gestalt consciousness composed of the combined psychic energy of every Tyranid organism in existence. The hive mind does not think the way you or I think. It does not plan or scheme or hope or fear. It processes, it adapts, it optimizes. And its only goal, the single overwhelming directive that drives every claw and every talon and every biological weapon system in the swarm, is to consume. Consume biomass. Consume genetic material. Strip worlds down to bare rock, absorb the organic matter, incorporate useful genetic data into the swarm's ever-evolving pool of biological weapons, and move on to the next world. Do this forever. Do this everywhere. There is nothing else. There is no other purpose. The hive mind does not want a trophy or a throne. It wants to eat the galaxy, and it has been eating its way through the universe for so long that the people it is currently consuming may not even be aware of the true scale of what hungers for them. The technology the Tyranids use is entirely biological. There are no metal ships, no plasma reactors, no machine spirits in their vessels. Their hive ships are living creatures, enormous organisms grown for the specific purpose of traveling through space, housing hundreds of thousands of smaller organisms in their internal chambers, and descending on target worlds to begin the process of consumption. Their weapons are symbiotic creatures, living guns, living artillery, living blades, or organisms bred to serve as weapons for other organisms that serve as soldiers. All of them networked into the psychic web of the hive mind, so that every shot fired, every claw strike landed, every organism killed or consumed contributes data back to the collective in real time. When a Tyranid hive fleet descends on a world, the process is methodical and total. Vanguard organisms, genestealers hidden within the cargo holds of trading vessels, infiltrating populations years or decades before the main fleet arrives, corrupt local societies from within, breeding hybrid offspring and building cults that weaken planetary defenses at the critical moment. Then the hive ships arrive in orbit, and begin to carpet the upper atmosphere with spores. Mycetic spores drop through the clouds like a biological bombardment, each one containing organisms ready to fight. The shadow in the warp falls, cutting off all communication and psychic navigation, leaving the planet isolated and screaming into silence. And then the swarms begin their work. Cities fall, forests are stripped, the seas are drunk, the atmosphere is inhaled, the soil is dissolved and absorbed. In the end, nothing remains, just a rock, bare and dead, drifting in the dark. All its accumulated billions of years of biological complexity reduced to nutrient paste that fuels the growth of the next generation of Tyranid bioforms. This is what the hive mind does. This is all it does. The fleets that have hit the Milky Way so far, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and the many smaller fleets and splinter tendrils that have peeled off from the main bodies, are, here according to the most unsettling academic estimates, likely not the full weight of what is coming. They are the Vanguard, the leading edge. Somewhere behind them, still making the long crossing through the intergalactic void, is everything else. And if the true scale of the Tyranid threat ever reaches the Milky Way in full, there will not be a battle. There will be an ending. But we are not there yet. And in the meantime, the Tyranids are running into something they did not expect. Something that has no biomass to consume, cannot be killed in any conventional sense, and draws power from the very emotions the Tyranids are utterly incapable of generating. Part 2. The Chaos Gods, born from the screaming of civilizations. The Chaos Gods are old, older in some ways, than anything else that could be called a person or a power or a thinking thing in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. They were not created by anyone. No ancient alien race built them. No cosmic engineer designed them. No deliberate act brought them into being. They emerged. They condensed. They crystallized out of something far older and stranger than any civilization. The warp, the Imperium, the Imperium, the Sea of Souls, the realm that exists alongside and beneath and through the physical universe, is not empty. It has never been empty. It is an ocean of psychic energy, a dimension defined not by physics, but by emotion, where every thought and feeling and dream and nightmare generated by every thinking being in the material universe leaves a trace, a ripple, a stain. The warp is, in a very real sense, as the collected interior life of all sentient species in the universe, given form and substance and made into a place you could, theoretically, travel through. In the deep past, when intelligent life in the galaxy was young and scattered, the warp was relatively calm. Its currents were turbulent but without direction. Its denizens were formless things, shapes of pure emotion without will or purpose. But as civilizations grew, as wars were fought and plagues spread and empires rose and fell, as billions of beings lived and feared and loved and raged and despaired and hoped, the pressure in the warp built. The emotional currents grew stronger, and eventually, inevitably, they began to coalesce. Khorne was first, or at least among the first, the blood god, the lord of battle, the most powerful of the four great chaos gods in the current age. What he is not simply the god of murder, though murder is certainly his domain. He is the god of all that war entails, the courage that makes soldiers stand in the face of death, the fury that breaks the line, the skill that separates a warrior from prey, the martial pride that has driven every charging foot soldier and every sword-swinging champion since the first two beings in the universe decided to resolve a dispute by hitting each other. He is the physical manifestation of conflict itself, and as long as there is war anywhere in the galaxy, Khorne grows stronger. His domain in the warp is a landscape of iron and bone, towers built from skulls reaching toward a brazen sky, rivers of blood running between fortresses of endless grinding violence. Nurgle grew alongside Khorne, possibly older than him, emerging from the universal mortal terror of death, disease, and despair. But do not mistake Nurgle for a purely dark god in the simple sense. He loves his followers. He genuinely, in his deeply disturbing way, loves all life. loves it with the smothering, overwhelming affection of something that sees decay and death as simply another form of change, another form of growth, another form of connection. He is the father of plagues, yes. He is the lord of rot, the patron of the diseased and dying. But he is also the god of the comfort that comes from accepting inevitability. His domain is a garden of death and fecundity together, where beautiful things bloom in filth and the cycle of decay and regeneration never stops. Tzeentch is the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the god of mutation and change and hope and knowledge and treachery and ambition and all the complicated, scheming interior life of minds that reach for things beyond themselves. He is the reason there are plans within plans, plots within plots. The reason nothing in the warp can ever be fully trusted, because Tzeentch has had his fingers in everything for longer than most civilizations have existed. His realm is a place of constant, impossible transformation, where geometry does not obey itself, where color has sound and sound has weight, and nothing stays the same from one moment to the next. And then there is Slaanesh, the youngest and strangest of the four. The Dark Prince was born far more recently, in cosmic terms, than the other three. Slaanesh emerged from the Eldar, a species of ancient, powerful psychic beings whose emotions were so much more intense and so much more resonant in the warp than those of most species that when their civilization fell into hedonistic excess, the accumulated weight of their pleasure and their sensation and their appetite created something monstrous. In roughly the 30th millennium, the Elder Empire finally collapsed under the weight of its own indulgence, and in a single catastrophic event, the accumulated psychic energy detonated. A hole was torn in reality. The Eye of Terror was born, and Slaanesh screamed into existence, a god of pleasure, pain, sensation, desire, and excess, consuming most of the Eldar souls in existence the moment it awoke. The few who survived scattered to craft worlds, to the webway, was to dark places with darker bargains, and have lived in terror of their own creation ever since. What is crucial to understand about all four of these gods is what sustains them, not worship exactly, though worship helps channel power to specific patrons. What the Chaos gods need, what they are literally made of and continuously fed by, is emotion, mortal emotion. The rage of soldiers in battle feeds Khorne, the despair of the dying feeds Nurgle, the ambition and anxiety of scholars and schemers feeds Tzeentch. The passion and desire and sensation-seeking of living beings feeds Slaanesh. They cannot exist without the emotional output of thinking, feeling, sentient species. They are not just empowered by sentient life, they are constructed from it. They are the accumulated psychic residue of every war, every plague, every dream, and every nightmare that mortal minds have ever generated, given will and form and terrible intelligence. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer scale of what this means. Every time you have felt afraid, somewhere in the warp that fear was a tiny note added to Nurgle's symphony. Every time you have felt the hot rush of anger, a molecule of Khorne's ocean was replenished. Every human ambition, every elder dream, every orc's savage joy in battle, all of it, every fragment of it across billions of beings across thousands of years, pours into the warp and sustains these entities. They are not gods in the way a mortal might imagine a god, distant, disinterested, existing in some clean divine space apart from the world. They are the world's interior life made manifest, as they are what happens to emotional energy when there is nowhere else for it to go. This also means they are, in a peculiar way, reactive rather than originating forces. The Chaos gods did not create the galaxy's suffering. The galaxy's suffering created them. They have, over long ages, learned to encourage and deepen the suffering that sustains them, to reach back through the warp and corrupt mortal lives in ways that generate more and richer emotional input. Khorne inspires warriors to greater violence. Nurgle's plagues create more despair, more hopeless acceptance, more of the warm, cold embrace of inevitability that his followers know too well. Tzeentch's schemes produce more uncertainty, more hope invested in uncertain outcomes, more of the frantic, scheming energy that feeds him. Slanesh's corruptions deepen desire and sensation until the beings it has touched exist in a permanent state of escalating appetite that nothing can satisfy. They are, in this sense, very good at their jobs, but their jobs are entirely dependent on the existence of material beings to perform them on. This means the Chaos Gods have a vested interest in the continued existence of sentient life. They need it the way a fire needs fuel. Yes, their agents corrupt and destroy civilizations, tear planets apart, kill billions. But they do not want the galaxy to be empty. An empty galaxy is a dead warp. A dead warp is dead gods. The Chaos Gods, for all their terrifying destructive power, are in a very real sense dependent on the galaxy they seem to be trying to destroy. And this is exactly where things get interesting when the Tyranids come along. Action Part 3. Two Great Hungers, One Galaxy. Why these forces cannot coexist. Picture the situation from the perspective of a Chaos God. You are an entity of immeasurable power, composed of the psychic energy of billions of sentient beings, woven from their deepest emotions, their most powerful drives. You have existed for millennia, perhaps longer. You have shaped civilizations and broken empires. You have servants beyond counting, armies of demons given form by the pure intensity of the emotions you embody. You look out at the galaxy, your galaxy, the living thing that feeds and sustains you, and what do you see coming? A swarm, not an army, not a civilization with ambitions that can be twisted, not a species with emotions that can be corrupted. A swarm, a biological machine, a living tide of creatures that think as one, feel as one, yet and feel almost nothing at all, by any standard that would make sense to a Chaos God. The Tyranids do not feel rage in the way Horn hungers for. They do not despair in the way that feeds Nurgle. They do not scheme or hope or dream in any fashion that would nourish Sench. They do not desire or seek sensation in any way that satisfies Slanesh. The Hive mind is not built from the same emotional architecture that the Chaos Gods feed on. The Hive mind is, from the perspective of the Warp, something like a void, an absence, a vast, overwhelming psychic presence that drowns out the emotional static that normally fills the Imperium, not by replacing it with its own version, not by generating different emotions, but by simply generating so much alien psychic noise at a frequency incompatible with chaos, that the signal the Chaos Gods depend on is smothered. This is the shadow in the Warp, and we will get to that in detail, but the fundamental incompatibility runs deeper than just psychic interference. Think about what it means for a Chaos God to encounter a species it simply cannot reach. Every other intelligent species the Chaos Gods have dealt with has had the same fundamental vulnerability. They have interior lives. They have things they want, and things they fear, and things they grieve, and things they desire. These are the hooks. These are the entry points through which corruption finds its way in. You find what a person values most, and you offer them a version of it that bends their will toward the dark. You find what a person fears most, and you send that fear walking toward them, wearing a familiar face. You find what a person despairs over, and you whisper that the despair will never end unless they accept a different master. None of this works on a Tyranid organism, not because the Tyranids are particularly noble or spiritually pure, but because the hooks are simply not there. An individual Hormigaunt does not have things it wants beyond the immediate biological directive to find prey. It does not fear death in the way that produces exploitable spiritual weakness, because it has no individual conception of itself as something worth preserving. When it dies, its biomass is recycled, a new Hormigaunt produced from the same biological material, and the swarm continues. The individual organism is, from the hive mind's perspective, a disposable expression of the collective whole. You cannot corrupt a soldier by offering them power and survival when the soldier is not capable of distinguishing itself from the army it serves. And the hive mind itself, the actual guiding intelligence behind every Tyranid in existence, is not an entity in any sense that offers a Chaos God purchase. It does not have desires that can be redirected. It does not have fears that can be weaponized. It does not have a name that could be spoken as a prayer or a curse. It is not a being that can be bargained with or betrayed. It is a process, a biological computing process of incomprehensible scale, operating with perfect clarity on its single objective. There is nothing for a chaos god to hook into because there is nothing sticking out. The Tyranids cannot eat demons. Yet the biomass of a demon, if you can even call it biomass, given that a demon is a construct of pure warp energy given temporary material form, is useless to the hive mind. It has no genetic information worth incorporating. It has no protein structure worth consuming. It is, to the Tyranids, nutritionally meaningless. When a Tyranid bites a demon, it might as well be biting a hologram. The physical manifestation may exist for a moment, long enough to be torn apart by claw, or dissolved by acid, or blasted by a zoanthrope's psychic lance. But there is nothing to eat in the aftermath. No biomass, no reward. And from the demon's side, the situation is equally frustrating. A demon that possesses a mortal draws power from that mortal's soul, their fear, their pain, their joy at being chosen. As a demon that corrupts a world, taints the psychic resonance of everyone on it, feeding power back through the warp to its god. But a Tyranid organism has no soul in any sense the warp recognizes. There is no individual psychic presence to corrupt, no personal will to bend, no emotional life to drink from. There is only the hive mind's cold, alien signal, vast and utterly alien, and completely indigestible to any entity that runs on mortal emotion as its fuel source. The ruinous powers can see the Tyranids. Their greater servants know they are there, but they cannot do anything meaningful with them, and the Tyranids cannot do anything meaningful with them in return. They are two forces occupying the same physical space that simply cannot interact in any productive way, except by destroying each other. And destroying each other is a problem, because both forces need the galaxy, but they need it in completely incompatible ways. The Chaos Gods need the galaxy full of living, breathing, feeling, suffering, hoping, fearing beings. They need it populated and emotional and psychically active. The more torment and passion and ambition in the galaxy, the more powerful they become. The Tyranids need the galaxy full of biomass, organic material, living structures, the accumulated biological complexity of billions of years of evolution on 1 million worlds. They do not care about the emotional state of what they consume. They just need it to exist so they can eat it. But here is the catastrophic problem. The Tyranids do not consume what chaos has already touched. A world racked by demonic incursion, where reality has partially dissolved, but where warp energy has soaked into the soil and the air and the bodies of the population, is not useful to the hive mind. The biomass is tainted, corrupted, saturated with the inconstant energy of the Imperium. It cannot be properly digested. It is, in the Tyranids' biological assessment of the universe, spoiled food. And if enough of the galaxy is claimed by chaos, if the Great Rift spreads its corruption far enough, if enough worlds are consumed by demonic energy rather than by Tyranid acid and chitin, then the hive mind is looking at a galaxy full of rotting food it cannot eat. Meanwhile, from Chaos's perspective, a galaxy consumed by the Tyranids is a galaxy from which all psychic sustenance has been drained. Every world stripped of its biosphere, every thinking species eaten down to the last being, is every emotional signal silenced. That is a galaxy in which the Chaos Gods slowly starve. They cannot feed on a dead warp. And the Tyranids, by consuming the living beings that generate warp energy, are in the most literal possible sense, eating the Chaos Gods' food source out from under them. Two great hungers, one galaxy, completely incompatible appetites, and no way for either to get what they want if the other is allowed to succeed. Part 4. The Shadow in the Warp. The hive mind's psychic weapon. Let us take a moment to genuinely appreciate the shadow in the warp, because it is one of the most fascinating and terrible phenomena in the entire 40,000 setting, and its relationship to chaos is going to be central to everything that follows. The shadow in the warp is not a weapon in the conventional sense. The Tyranids did not design it, did not engineer it as a countermeasure to psychic enemies. It is simply a consequence, an inevitable side effect of the way the hive mind works. The hive mind is not located in any single place. It does not sit in a control room somewhere giving orders. It is the collective psychic presence of every Tyranid organism in a fleet, a gestalt consciousness built from the simultaneous mental activity of trillions of beings, all of them continuously communicating with each other, and with the overarching will of the swarm through a constant, massive broadcast of psychic signal. This signal is alien. It is profoundly, deeply, categorically alien in a way that nothing born in the Milky Way can quite process. It operates on frequencies and in conceptual spaces that do not map to any emotion or experience or thought that a human or elder or any other native species of the galaxy would recognize. And it is loud. So extraordinarily loud that within its range, it simply drowns out everything else. For ordinary humans, the approach of a Tyranid fleet is preceded by a creeping dread that builds for days or weeks before the first organism arrives. Not a premonition in the way a psyker might have a premonition, but a deep biological unease, a sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the world, a feeling like listening to a radio broadcast where something has begun broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, and the static is getting louder and nothing makes sense anymore. Animals go mad. Insects behave strangely. People report nightmares they cannot describe, and then the dreams start. Alien dreams, full of rushing darkness and a cold hunger that has no center and no end. For psychers, it is much worse. A human with even minor psychic sensitivity, caught within the shadow in the warp's range, will experience increasing mental distress, headaches that feel like knives, the sense of something vast and utterly disinterested pressing against the inside of their skull. Full astropaths, psychers trained to send and receive messages through the warp, find their abilities jammed, the signal they need to transmit their messages overwhelmed by the alien static. Navigators, those mutated humans who use their third eye to see into the warp and guide ships through it, find the warp around them full of nothing but that same psychic white noise, as making navigation impossible, isolated from their communication networks, cut off from reinforcements, blinded in the very medium they use to move between stars. Worlds under the shadow in the warp are isolated long before the first Tyranid claw touches their soil. For Eldar, even a fraction of the shadow's power is agonizing. The Eldar are so deeply psychically sensitive, so thoroughly attuned to the warp in ways that come from millions of years of natural psychic evolution, that the signal of the hive mind is like a physical assault on their minds. There are accounts of Eldar falling into convulsions simply from nearing a shadow in the warp strong enough to register on their senses. They're farseers, who normally see decades and centuries ahead in the ever-shifting probability currents of the warp, and find their visions clouded and meaningless, all the delicate threads of future possibility replaced by one overwhelming, rushing, terrifying absence. And for demons, entities that exist within the warp, built from its substance, sustained by its currents, the shadow in the warp is something qualitatively different again. It does not merely discomfort them or cloud their vision. It erodes the very substrate they exist in. A demon manifesting in the physical world, in an area saturated by the shadow, finds its connection to its home realm weakened, the flow of warp energy sustaining its physical form disrupted and degraded. A demon, sufficiently deep within the shadow's influence, cannot maintain material form. It weakens, its abilities fail, and the psychic lance of a Tyranid zoanthrope, but powered by the same alien signal that is already dissolving the demon's foundations, becomes capable of something remarkable, destroying it, not just banishing it. Banishment sends a demon back to the warp, where it will eventually recover and reconstitute itself. The shadow in the warp, at sufficient intensity, can do something worse. It can unmake. This is not yet confirmed canon in the most absolute sense. It is implied rather than stated outright. But the evidence points toward the shadow being capable, under the right circumstances and at the right intensity, of not merely disrupting demonic manifestation, but actually silencing the portion of the warp that was supporting it. Like pressing a burning brand into a pool of oil, suppressing the fire rather than just moving it elsewhere. The shadow in the warp, in short, it is the hive mind's relationship with the Imperium, rendered in practical terms. A vast, alien psychic presence that does not care about the warp, does not feed from it, does not worship or fear or interact with it in any of the ways that every other psychic species does. And in its absolute indifference, drowns it out. And when Hive Fleet Kronos, which we will get to shortly, is involved, the shadow is not merely strong, it is catastrophic. It reaches such intensity that small warp rifts, literal tears in reality that demons pour through from the immaterium into the material world, have been forced closed by its psychic pressure. The hive mind does not know it is doing this. There is no triumph in the hive mind when a warp rift closes. There is no strategy. There is only the presence of the swarm, vast and cold and utterly indifferent, pressing against reality, and the reality pressing back and the demons caught between the two, being reduced to whispers and silence. Part 5. The Fall of Shadowbrink. The day the hive mind ate a demonic incursion. In the year 854,998 Sham 41, during the period known as the Third Tyrannic War, a cathedral world called Shadowbrink found itself caught between two catastrophes simultaneously. Shadowbrink itself was unremarkable by the standards of the Imperium, a world of grand spires and soaring church architecture, its surface covered in monuments to the Emperor's glory, its population of faithful souls living under the ancient stone eyes of 1,000 carved saints. It had no particular strategic value that would have drawn the attention of warlords or fleet commanders, except for one thing hidden beneath its capital city of Rosov, something that even the planetary governor did not fully appreciate the danger of until it was far, far too late. Beneath Rosov lay the Maelstrom Cradle. This device was a relic from the dark age of technology, a ring of archaeotech whose purpose the Inquisition had never fully decoded. What they had established was this: the device responded to the deaths occurring around it. Every soul lost in proximity to the Maelstrom Cradle fed its mechanism in some way, strengthening its connection to the warp, building pressure in the barrier between realities, like water building behind a dam. The Inquisition had classified it, contained it, assigned a permanent garrison of Grey Knights to perform daily rituals of psychic warding around it. Well, they had been doing this for 30 years when Hive Fleet Leviathan arrived. The Grey Knights' problem was immediately clear. They could not allow the population of Shadowbrink to evacuate, because the process of mass panic and death that would inevitably accompany a Tyranid invasion would feed the Maelstrom Cradle with exactly the kind of soul energy it needed to fully activate. Their librarian, Brother Cadulon, understood this. He could not let the people leave, because leaving would mean chaos, would mean death, would mean the cradle opening, and he could not stop the Tyranids, because the orbital defenses of Shadowbrink held out for exactly 3 hours against Leviathan's first assault before the sky was clear and the spores were falling. The Tyranids came down like a biological storm. Billions of organisms descended across Shadowbrink's surface. The trenches that the planetary defense forces had spent weeks preparing were overrun in hours. The major cities fell one by one. The Grey Knights fought where they could, deploying their dreadnoughts, towering war machines carrying space marine sorcerers, against the leading edges of the swarm. But there is a reason they say you cannot stop a Tyranid invasion, only delay it. The swarm adapted. The waves kept coming. The Grey Knights were overwhelmed. And as the last major defensive lines collapsed, as millions of Shadowbrink's faithful died screaming while the swarm consumed everything around them, the Maelstrom Cradle activated. The ground beneath Rosov split open, as light poured up from the cracks. Not light in any normal optical sense, but the light that the warp makes when it tears through into reality. That sick phosphorescence that burns wrong and feels wrong and makes the mind instinctively scrabble for something rational to hold on to.
Okay, I have to stop here for a second and just say, this is genuinely one of my favorite corners of 40k lore to sit with. Like, most threats in this setting want something recognizable. Chaos wants souls, the orcs want to fight, even the Necrons have this ancient grudge you can at least understand. But the Tyranids, they just want to eat. There's no malice, no ideology, no ego, just hunger on a scale that makes everything else feel small. And the idea that this mindless, unstoppable consumption might actually be the thing that starves out gods, that genuinely gets under my skin in the best way. It's not even a war, really. It's more like watching a fire and a flood moving toward each other. And you're just standing there trying to figure out which one wins. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The warp rift opened, and from it, in a vast and terrible flowering of demonic energy, the quadrifold abominatum emerged. The quadrifold abominatum was no ordinary demonic incursion. This was 4 greater demons, the most powerful individual demonic beings that can exist in the material universe below the gods themselves, operating together, a cabal of destruction that had laid waste to entire world systems over the preceding 10,000 years. Hak Vasha, a bloodthirster of Khorne, a being of pure violence and killing rage larger than a battle tank, radiating a fury so intense that the air itself felt pressurized near it. Shubluth Gug, a great unclean one of Nurgle, a massive, ponderous, nauseating thing of bloated flesh and impossible diseases, its very presence causing plague to spontaneously generate in the bodies of anything nearby. Kurikshikra, a lord of change from Tzeentch's legions, a vast avian intelligence burning with sorcerous fire, its eyes seeing through time in every direction at once. And Leshajethiha, a keeper of secrets dedicated to Slanesh, perfect and terrible, and moving with a liquid grace that made looking at it hurt in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. 4 greater demons, a combined force representing every chaos god simultaneously, descending on a world already in the process of being consumed by the Tyranids. As they expected the Tyranids to react the way everything reacted to greater demons, with panic, with disorder, with the psychic resonance of fear and rage feeding the demons' power, making them stronger, making the rift wider, making more of their kin pour through. Every battlefield they had ever fought on before had given them that terror, anguish, the delicious emotional static of beings fighting desperately against something they could barely comprehend. The Tyranids looked at them and felt nothing. This is the thing about the Hive mind, that the demons, for all their thousands of years of experience, had simply never encountered before. The Tyranids looked at the quadrifold abominatum and assessed them the way you might assess a geological obstacle. Are they a threat to the consumption of biomass? Yes. Can they be neutralized? This is assess and calculate. What is the optimal approach? Determine. What resources need to be allocated? Allocate. The entire process was cold and mechanical and utterly devoid of the emotional resonance that greater demons depend on to sustain themselves in the material world. The Hive mind, having assessed the threat, made a decision that would have been astonishing if it were capable of astonishment. It adapted in real time. Rippers that had been consuming biomass across other parts of the continent were redirected to strip the flesh from recently killed organisms, feeding raw biological material back into the swarm's living production network. Within hours of the Maelstrom cradle opening, the Hive mind had redirected enough biomass to begin producing new specialized bioforms, exocrines and biovores, and Tyranid creatures specialized for long-range artillery bombardment. They grew out of the biological infrastructure of the swarm, like military equipment being manufactured on an assembly line. Except the assembly line was itself alive, and the end products walked off it ready to fight. The demons surged toward the Tyranid lines and ran into a wall of acid artillery and biological firepower. Exocrines discharged their bioplasma in volleys that dissolved demonic forms with searing efficiency. Biovorers lobbed spore mines that saturated the ground with acid spores, turning the approach to the Tyranid lines into a nightmare of dissolving flesh. For any conventional army, The sight of 4 greater demons marching at the head of a demonic host would have been the end. Routing, collapse, slaughter. The Tyranids did not root, because they could not root. There was no morale to break, there was no fear to exploit. There was only the hive mind's assessment that these enemies needed to be neutralized, and the ongoing, patient application of overwhelming biological force in service of that assessment. The fighting lasted days. The demons attempted everything. Khorne's forces threw themselves into the Tyranid lines in desperate close combat. But in the absence of mortal blood being spilled, in the absence of the fury and suffering that the blood god's servants thrive on, the fighting provided no spiritual sustenance. No blood was being spilled for Khorne, only alien ichor that meant nothing to him. Nurgle's diseases, which could fell a space marine in minutes and had driven entire planets to mass death throughout history, proved useless against Tyranid adaptation. And the hive mind absorbed the genetic information of each plague it encountered, and within the same battle was already producing organisms with specific biological countermeasures. Nurgle's greatest weapon, the plague that had never been faced before, was encountered, assessed, countered, and catalogued, all while the battle continued. The decisive moment came when the great unclean one Shub-Luthgug made his move. He was the most powerful psycho of the 4 demons, a being capable of tremendous sorcerous destruction, and he pushed forward, attempting to break the deadlock with a display of raw warp power. Except the shadow in the warp was already dense around Shadowbrink, thickened by the collective psychic presence of billions of Tyranid organisms. Shub-Luthgug reached for the warp to fuel his powers and found almost nothing. Static, as alien static, crushing and cold. His psychic abilities, which had leveled cities before, sputtered and failed. He was standing in the heart of the hive mind's psychic territory now, and the hive mind had no interest in accommodating his needs. The zoanthropes found him in his moment of vulnerability. These creatures, Tyranid psychers shaped like bloated, floating brains encased in thin heating shells, did not fight like the other organisms. They did not swarm, or bite, or claw. They channeled the concentrated psychic energy of the hive mind and discharged it in focused bursts of biological sorcery. And in the shadow in the warp, where the only psychic signal was the alien roar of the swarm, their power was uncontested. The warp blast that hit Shub-Luthgug was not just powerful, it was tuned, but in whatever way the hive mind tunes these things, to the exact frequency that was already smothering him. And the great unclean one of Nurgle, one of the most powerful individual demons in existence, was blown apart. With the death of one of their own, with Shub-Luthgug banished back to the warp shattered and screaming, the quadrifold abominatum understood, perhaps for the first time in their immeasurably long existence, that they were losing. The Lord of Change, Kariksikra, being a creature of perfect self-interest and schemes, with no personal investment in anything except its own continuity, did what any sensible entity of infinite calculation would do. It blasted its way back to the Maelstrom cradle, dove back into the warp, and left. Tzeentch's greater demon, the planner of 10,000 schemes, recognized that this particular scheme was over. The bloodthirster and the keeper of secrets, driven by the less flexible imperatives of their respective natures, made one final charge. Hakvasha led it, roaring with a fury that meant nothing in the shadow in the warp's silence, axe swinging, killing machines around it even as they dragged it down by sheer numbers. The hive mind had prepared. Tyranofexes, massive multi-limbed Tyranid artillery creatures, met the charge with biocannons. Trigons, serpentine tunneling beasts larger than land trains, erupted from the ground in the middle of the demonic formation. When the bloodthirster was finally pulled back into the warp, it was wrestling with 3 Trigons simultaneously, being dragged apart even as it went. The last of the quadrifold abominatum was banished. The demonic host, without its greater demon leadership and stripped of psychic sustenance by the shadow in the warp, dissolved, and the hive mind turned its full attention back to what it had come for in the first place. Shadowbrink was consumed, utterly, everything on it, Everything that had survived the battle was stripped and processed and incorporated into the swarm's biomass stores. The cathedral spires, the consecrated ground, the bones of the faithful and the foul alike, all of it went into the Tyranids' biological processing. It is worth pausing here to consider what this moment must have looked like from the perspective of a Grey Knight, one of those elite space marines whose entire purpose is the fight against demonic incursion. The Grey Knights of Cadulon's command had fought and died to hold the line against the Tyranids, and then, while they were losing that fight, the Maelstrom Cradle had opened anyway, and the Quadrifold Abominatum had emerged. Two catastrophes simultaneously. Any reasonable tactical analysis would have said the world was lost on multiple levels, and then the Tyranids had beaten the demons. The thing that had beaten the Grey Knights had beaten the demons that the Grey Knights exist specifically to fight. There is something disorienting about that from a purely human perspective. The demons were supposed to be the threat. The Tyranids were supposed to be the threat. Having them fight each other and watching the Tyranids win is not a victory for anyone, but it is hard not to feel some dark fascination at the spectacle of the Hive mind, cold, unhurried, utterly indifferent, turning its biological resources toward a demonic incursion the way you might turn a thermostat down in a warm room, not with drama, not with heroism, just with efficient, methodical application of whatever resources were at hand. The Battle of Shadowbrink was not particularly large by the standards of the Third Tyrannic War, but it was historically unique. It was, as far as Imperial scholars have been able to establish, the first time in recorded history that Tyranid forces had faced a combined force of all four Chaos God's servants simultaneously, and won, decisively, without significant adaptation failure. The Hive mind had processed the information, allocated the resources, produced the necessary countermeasures, and eliminated the threat, all in real time, over the course of a few days of biological warfare. Somewhere in its vast, cold, alien intelligence, it stored what it had learned. Part 6. The Great Rift changes everything. For a very long time after Shadowbrink, the relationship between the Tyranids and Chaos remained exactly what it had always been. Mutual avoidance punctuated by occasional, uncomfortable proximity. The Chaos Gods focused on their great games, their eternal war with each other, and with the Imperium, their corruption of worlds and corruption of souls. The Tyranids focused on consuming the Eastern Fringe, methodically stripping world after world, the great Hive fleets driving deeper into the galaxy from multiple directions. Each force, when it encountered the other, tended to back away. The Tyranids had no interest in fighting something they could not eat. The Chaos Gods had no interest in wasting demonic power on something that generated no useful psychic energy in return. Then the Great Rift opened. In 999 M41, at the end of the 41st Millennium, Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade achieved something that no preceding Black Crusade had managed. Cadia fell, the great world that had served as the primary bulwark against the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, the planet whose very geology served as a stabilizing anchor against warp overflow because of the mysterious pylons buried in its crust, was destroyed. With the Cadian pylons broken and the Eye of Terror unplugged from its ancient restraints, a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions erupted. Reality tore. A wound in the fabric of the galaxy opened and spread, racing outward from the Eye of Terror, stretching across the stars toward the Eastern Fringe's Hadex anomaly, ultimately creating a rift that cut the galaxy roughly in half from one side to the other. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a permanent scar in the material universe through which warp energy poured continuously, corrupting everything within reach, drowning systems in demonic incursions, cutting off the light of the Astronomicon from vast swaths of Imperial territory, and demonstrating in the most visceral possible way that Chaos had won something. Not the final victory, not the destruction of the Imperium, but something real and lasting and catastrophically significant. For the Imperium, the consequences were dire. The galaxy was divided, communication and travel were disrupted, worlds fell silent, isolated, unable to call for help or receive it. What a new dark age began, and only the unexpected return of Reboot Gilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, resurrected from his 10,000-year coma, gave the Imperium any hope of navigating it. But for the Tyranids, the Great Rift was something arguably worse, because the Great Rift did not merely disrupt Imperial supply lines and communication networks. It disrupted something the hive mind depends on. The hive fleets navigate by psychic beacon. Specifically, most theories suggest, by the Astronomicon, the massive psychic lighthouse projected from Terra by the Emperor's agony on the Golden Throne. This signal, which allows navigators to guide ships through the warp, also provides the hive mind with a directional reference for its advance into the heart of the galaxy. With the Great Rift partially obscuring the Astronomicon, it is with vast regions of space suddenly saturated with hostile warp energy rather than the relatively stable space-time the Tyranids prefer to operate in. Whole sections of the hive mind's operational map became unreliable. Splinter fleets lost contact. Tendrils of hive fleets that had been moving in coordinated patterns suddenly found themselves separated from the greater collective by the psychic static of the Great Rift. Some were destroyed. The warp storms that accompanied the rift's birth physically tore biological fleets apart, dragging living ships into the Imperium, where they suffocated in an environment as hostile to them as the depths of space would be to a land animal. Others drifted, disconnected from the hive mind, operating on instinct alone, their strategic coherence gone. Watched at the devastation of Bull, the battle where Hive Fleet Leviathan descended on the Blood Angels' home system and came very close to wiping out one of the Imperium's oldest and most storied Space Marine chapters. The Great Rift itself intervened. At the moment of Leviathan's greatest victory over Baal's defenders, a massive warp storm generated by the Rift's birth consumed a significant portion of the Tyranid fleet in orbit. Entire Hive ship wings were dragged into the Imperium and destroyed. The fleet that had been winning was suddenly in retreat. But the same event that broke Leviathan's assault on Baal also released Cornate demons into the system. The battle continued with Blood Angels and their successors fighting both surviving Tyranids and the demonic incursion simultaneously. The Tyranids and demons, if unable to feed on each other, fought the Blood Angels instead. It was the most chaotic, in every sense, battlefield the galaxy had seen in decades. The aftermath left the hive mind with a very serious strategic problem. Whole corridors of galactic territory that should have been available for consumption were now saturated with chaos energy. Demon worlds, where reality had partially dissolved. Systems under constant warp storm activity. Regions where the boundary between the material universe and the Imperium was so thin and so unstable that Tyranid organisms moving through them risked being torn apart by random warp events. Biomass that should have fed the swarm was instead corrupted, contaminated, useless. The hive mind had never encountered this scale of environmental contamination before. Warp storms had always been local, yet temporary obstacles to root around. The Great Rift was neither local nor temporary. It was a permanent structural feature of the galaxy, and it was growing. Consider for a moment what this actually means for a species that operates the way the Tyranids do. A hive fleet in transit between star systems is essentially a migration. Billions of organisms in cold hibernation aboard living ships. The Narval, at the center of the fleet, using its specialized biological gravity manipulation organs to fold space and achieve superluminal travel. This process requires a reasonably stable space-time medium to function in. A warp storm of sufficient intensity is not just a hazard to navigate around. It physically disrupts the gravitational reference points that Narvals use to slingshot the fleet through space. Or as a fleet caught between two large warp storms could find itself effectively becalmed, unable to navigate, unable to communicate with the broader hive mind, cut off from the coordination that makes the swarm more than the sum of its parts. This is precisely what happened to dozens of splinter fleets in the wake of the Great Rift's opening. The galaxy-spanning storm did not affect all fleets equally. The main bodies were largely intact, and their sheer psychic mass provided some protection against the warp's interference. But the smaller tendrils, the scout forces and advanced probes, were badly hit. Many simply disappeared. Some may have survived, drifting in regions of the galaxy that no longer appear on any reliable chart, operating on deep instinct without strategic direction. Others were certainly destroyed, and in each case, as the biomass that had been invested in those organisms, the genetic data they had accumulated, the consumption they had been tasked to complete, all of it lost. The hive mind does not grieve. It does not have the emotional architecture for grief, but it registers loss as surely as any computational system registers an error signal, and the signal it was receiving from the Great Rift was not an error. It was a new variable, a new kind of enemy action, an enemy action it had not accounted for because it had never encountered anything quite like the Chaos Gods operating at full galaxy-scale power before. The hive mind adapted, because the hive mind always adapts, and its adaptation to the Great Rift would take the form of something unprecedented, a purpose-built tool, a specialized hive fleet designed not for consumption and not for biomass acquisition, but for clearing. Part 7. Hive Fleet Kronos, the swarm that hunts gods. Hive Fleet. Kronos is unlike any other hive fleet in the history of Tyranid incursions into the Milky Way galaxy. Every fleet before it, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, Gorgon, Jormungandr, and all the rest, had a single overwhelming purpose. Find worlds with biomass, consume that biomass, move on. Fight anything that gets in the way, yes, but never lose sight of the food. The food is all that matters. Fighting is merely the obstacle between you and eating. Kronos does not think that way. Kronos was splintered from Hive Fleet Leviathan sometime after the Great Rift opened, in the era Indomitus, the new age that began with Gilliman's return and the Indomitus Crusade. But where Leviathan spawned splinter fleets of diminished purpose, was scattered and sometimes incoherent, Kronos was something deliberate, the hive mind having processed the reality of the Great Rift and understood that vast amounts of biomass were being rendered inaccessible by chaos corruption, produced a response. Not a fleet designed to consume, but a fleet designed to clear the corruption so that consumption could follow. Kronos exists to fight chaos, not incidentally, not as a side effect of pursuing biomass. That is its primary purpose, and the driving directive behind every organism it spawns, every bioform it deploys, every tactical decision it makes. It eats. Yes, it still needs sustenance to maintain itself, and Hive Fleet Leviathan has helpfully been leaving worlds in partially consumed states for Kronos to feed on as it moves. But the eating is instrumental. Kronos eats so it can fight, and other fleets fight so they can eat. The most immediately remarkable thing about Hive Fleet Kronos is its shadow in the warp. Every Hive fleet generates the shadow as a consequence of its collective psychic presence. But Kronos' shadow is different in magnitude and character to anything previously recorded. The connection between Kronos and the broader hive mind is described by Imperial scholars as suffocatingly powerful, meaning not just that it generates more psychic static than other fleets, but that the quality of the static is more focused, more intense, more specifically oriented toward the suppression of warp activity rather than simply the disruption of psychic communication. Where Kronos travels, the warp is crushed flat in the surrounding area. Our psychers in Kronos' range do not just experience disruption or static, they experience the active draining of their spiritual energy, their connection to the warp bled away by the overwhelming alien presence of the hive mind signal. An enemy psyker near a Kronos tendril is not just unable to use their powers, they are weakened, their reserves depleted, their link to the source of their strength actively pulled away. For demons, this effect reaches extreme lethality. Demonic entities that manifest in the material world maintain their physical form through a continuous connection to the warp, drawing sustenance and coherence from the Imperium even as they operate in real space. Under a normal hive fleet's shadow, this connection is strained and disrupted. Under Kronos' shadow, which reaches such intensity that it has been recorded closing small warp rifts through sheer psychic pressure, the connection is severed. Demons caught fully within Kronos' shadow do not merely get banished, they come apart. The warp fabric that was sustaining them is occupied by the alien frequency of the Hive mind, and there is simply no room left for demonic coherence. This has made Kronos extraordinarily effective against exactly the kinds of enemies the Great Rift is generating in abundance. Chaos-corrupted worlds, demonic incursions spilling out of warp rifts, Chaos Space Marine warbands operating in the shadow of the Great Rift, using warp storms as cover and launching raids into territories the Imperium can no longer properly defend. Kronos hunts all of them with a focused, methodical efficiency that its sister fleets do not share. The fleet's tactical doctrine reflects both its purpose and its prey. Typical Tyranid assault doctrine favors overwhelming close-range swarms, massed creatures throwing themselves at defenders in waves until the sheer biological pressure collapses the line. This is devastating against most enemies. Against the servants of chaos, specifically against demons, it is less effective because demons love close combat, thrive in it, draw power from the blood and rage and terror of a melee. Charging a demon horde with a swarm of hormagaunts is essentially feeding it. Kronos has adapted away from this. Its primary combat doctrine is ranged engagement and artillery dominance. Vast formations of termagants, Tyranid warriors armed with biocannons, and heavy artillery organisms like Tyranofexes and biovores establish fire superiority from maximum range and simply dissolve the enemy before they can close to melee. Neural nodes of maleceptors and zoanthropes, specifically the kinds of Tyranid organisms most effective at channeling and weaponizing the shadow in the warp, are placed at key positions in the line, their psychic presence thickening the shadow further in their immediate vicinity, making demonic manifestation in their specific area effectively impossible. The fleet refuses to be baited. This is perhaps most striking given how non-tactically the Tyranids are usually characterized. Multiple engagements with Chaos forces, including encounters with Night Lords, Chaos Space Marines, and Thousand Sun sorcerers, have shown Kronos responding to enemy tactical maneuvers, not with the brute force swarm response you might expect, but with calculated counter-positioning, dispersal tactics to deny the enemy a single point of devastating magical attack, and the patient, grinding attrition of ranged fire. When the Night Lords tried to lure Kronos away from a position by staging raids and creating distractions, the fleet simply absorbed the harassment and kept moving toward its actual objective, an astropathic beacon the Night Lords were using to guide lost ships to their doom. Kronos reached the beacon, neutralized it, and the Night Lords, unable to lure the swarm into the close combat trap they had prepared, withdrew. The Tyranids had not been baited, had not been distracted, had not been emotionally provoked into doing something tactically irrational. They never are. At the Wolf's Head Nebula, a naval engagement between an Imperial fleet under Admiral Grosson and a massive Chaos warfleet was dramatically interrupted when Kronos bioships entered the battle. They did not target the Imperial vessels. They swept through the Chaos formation, zeroing in on the lead despoiler-class battleship at its center, one of the largest and most powerful warships that Chaos can field, and swarmed over it. The Chaos fleet broke. Admiral Grosson, not questioning his good fortune, ordered a final salvo and retreated. The Tyranids paid no attention to the departing Imperial ships. They had what they came for, and then came the second battle of Shadowbrink. And Shadowbrink, the same world where High Fleet Leviathan had defeated the Quadrifold Abominatum years before, had been left as a stripped and lifeless rock after the consumption. But with the Great Rift spreading its influence, with warp energy surging through the galaxy in the aftermath of its birth, the old wound in the fabric of reality beneath what had once been Rossoff began to open again. The psychic scars of the original demonic incursion, the resonance left in the space where the Maelstrom Cradle had once been, provided a channel for new demonic activity. Hornate demons poured through. The world that had once been consumed came back, in a sense, as a demonic stronghold. There is something appropriate about this. the site where the Tyranids had first fought and beaten Chaos, was not done. Reality remembered the wound. The Maelstrom Cradle was gone, consumed along with everything else, but the space it had occupied in the local warp had been permanently scarred. And in the era of the Great Rift, scars like that do not stay closed. Kronos arrived in orbit above Shadowbrink. With the precision of a surgeon, the Hive mind deposited swarms at 8 specific points across the planet's surface. Areas of heightened warp activity identified from orbit, the strongest anchors for the demonic incursion. At each point, the neural node of Maleceptors and Zoanthropes was placed first, the psychic heavy weapons of the Tyranid arsenal, and around each node, the shadow in the warp was cranked to extraordinary intensity. Reality stabilized. The channels through which the demons were entering the material world began to narrow. The Cornate legions, and accustomed to an enemy that would fight back with the blood-feeding fury their god demanded, found themselves facing the same cold silence that Hakvasha had encountered years before. No rage, no blood, no sustenance. The demons charged the Tyranid lines and were met with the same wall of ranged fire that defined Kronos' entire doctrine. Wave after wave dissolved under bioplasma and acid spore fire. The Maleceptors focused the shadow until the warp rifts the demons were using as reinforcement channels narrowed and closed. And slowly, inevitably, the demonic presence on Shadowbrink was expunged. Shadowbrink was cleared, the world was then consumed, and Kronos moved on. The implications of this are staggering when you think about them carefully. A Tyranid Hive fleet has now demonstrated the ability to identify chaos-corrupted worlds. I should deploy to those worlds, close the warp rifts that are sustaining the corruption through the sheer psychic pressure of its shadow, eliminate the demonic presence, and then consume the cleared biomass. It is, from the Hive mind's perspective, a food remediation process. Clear the mold, then eat the food. But from the perspective of the Chaos Gods, what is happening is existentially threatening. One of their greatest tactical advantages in this era has always been that warp-corrupted worlds are essentially useless to their enemies, too dangerous for the Imperium to reclaim easily, too soaked in warp energy to be of use to the Necrons, too alien for the Elder to want. The demonic presence on a corrupted world was a near-permanent fixture, unless someone was willing to pay an enormous cost to clear it. Kronos pays no cost. As corruption is a resource problem it has solved, and it is growing. Part 8. Hive Fleet Tiamat, the Great Mystery if Hive Fleet. Kronos represents the Hive mind's immediate tactical response to the chaos problem, a tool for clearing and consuming corrupted territory. Then Hive Fleet Tiamat might represent something altogether stranger. Something that even the Inquisition's most brilliant analysts have not fully understood, and whose implications, if the more alarming theories are correct, could make Kronos look like a local pest control operation. Tiamat was first encountered in M35, during the 35th Millennium, centuries before Behemoth, the first Hive fleet in official Imperial records. This fact alone makes it unusual. It suggests Tiamat has been operating in the Milky Way, quietly and without triggering the catastrophic alarms that the later major fleets would generate, for a very long time. First contact was made by an explorator fleet of the Adeptus Mechanicus in a double-binary star system on the eastern fringe, known as the Tiamat system. The tech priest noted that all the worlds of the system shared suspiciously similar biological fauna, creatures that seemed to have migrated between worlds despite the impossible distances involved. They found this interesting rather than alarming, quarantined their ships as a precaution, and died there. Their final transmissions received 162 standard hours after their arrival. The Tiamat system was fusion-bombed several times over subsequent centuries. Life was never fully extinguished. Something kept regenerating. In the current era, the picture has clarified into something deeply worrying. Hive Fleet Tiamat has established itself in the Tiamat system, and, unlike every other Hive fleet in recorded history, has not consumed the worlds it controls. Specifically, on the jungle world of Xayaphoria, the fleet has been doing something unprecedented. Building, not consuming, not stripping, building. Over a continent-scale area of Xeophoria's surface, the Tyranids have constructed a structure that has no precedent anywhere in known xenobiology. It is described as a conical superstructure formed of chitin and soft encephalic flesh, brain-like material. In other words, the same kind of biological substrate that the hive mind uses to process and store information. It thrums with psychic energy, yet it is generating a shadow in the warp so powerful that when an Aeldari ranger patrol neared it, several rangers went into immediate convulsions, and the entire patrol was rendered comatose before they could withdraw. When a Deathwatch kill team under Watch Sergeant Gunheim investigated the system, they found the structure and its full scope. They also found the kill team's attached librarian, a space marine of significant psychic training and experience, having his head literally explode from the proximity to the structure's psychic output. The kill team extracted, just barely, and Gunheim sent a final transmission warning of what he had found before the pursuing Tyranids overwhelmed his position. Some of the world's structures are the size of mountains. The larger ones cover entire continents. The shadow in the warp in the Tiamat system is not merely powerful, it is overwhelming, more overwhelming than even Kronos' battlefield applications. It is as if all the psychic energy being focused at Shadowbrink or at a demonic incursion engagement is instead being poured continuously and on an ongoing basis into this one structure on this one planet. The Tyranids of Tiamat defend the system with single-minded, violent intensity that goes beyond even typical Hive fleet territorial behavior. Any ship that approaches too closely disappears. A Genestealer cult calling itself the Choir of the Void has been growing on Imperial worlds, its members making pilgrimages to Xeophoria, not to bring weapons or soldiers, but to bring biomass, actively feeding the structure. Even chaos-plagued worlds have produced pilgrims, the followers of what they call the Creed of Tiamat, who touched the surface of Xeophoria, were instantly drawn into thrall with the hive mind, and then were sent back out into the galaxy as missionaries, recruiting more pilgrims, more biomass, more psychic fuel for whatever is being built. The system has been declared quarantine extremis by the Imperium, the Deathwatch's Watch Fortress Holtmote, and the excommunicated Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman, the same Cryptman who first identified the scope of the Tyranid threat decades earlier, are the only forces actively working to understand what Tiamat is doing. And what they discuss, in their long sessions of analysis and argument, are theories that range from merely alarming to genuinely civilization-ending. A word about Cryptman here, because his presence tells us something important. This is a man who was stripped of his inquisitorial rank for an act of deliberate, calculated atrocity. His decision to seed the Octaria system with Tyranid Vanguard organisms, deliberately engineering a war between Hive Fleet Leviathan and the vast Orc Empire there, was made with full awareness of what it would cost in lives. Billions of people died in the Octarius War, consumed by the swarms or killed in the crossfire of one of the most violent conflicts in the galaxy's recent history. Cryptman accepted those deaths as a necessary cost for slowing a larger threat. The Inquisition excommunicated him for that choice, not because he was wrong about the threat, but because they could not officially sanction the deliberate sacrifice of billions of Imperial citizens as strategic policy. Just the fact that a man with that willingness to think in those terms, with that capacity for cold strategic calculus, came out of hiding specifically to work on the Tiamat problem, suggests that whatever he has seen in the data from Xeophoria has convinced him that this is where the most important decision in the current era will be made. Cryptman does not chase interesting problems for their own sake. He chases extinction-level threats. The first theory is that the structure is a beacon. The Astronomicon drew the Tyranids to the Milky Way in the first place, and the Pharaoh's overloading accelerated that. Tiamat may be building its own version, a psychic lighthouse of biological construction, designed to transmit a signal into the intergalactic void, powerful enough to be detected by whatever is still out there beyond the galaxy, were not to bring more of what has already arrived, but to summon the rest, the main body. If the Hive fleets currently in the Milky Way are truly just the Vanguard, then whatever lies behind them in the dark between galaxies would represent a force so far beyond current comprehension that the current Tyranid threat would look like a preliminary sketch. The second theory is that the structure is a weapon, a galaxy-scale amplifier for the shadow in the warp, designed to extend the hive mind's psychic suppression field from a local phenomenon, affecting systems within range of individual fleets, to something approaching a galaxy-wide coverage. If Tiamat's structure was completed and activated at full power, the theory goes that it could project the shadow across the entire Milky Way simultaneously, suppressing warp activity on a cosmic scale, and navigators unable to navigate, astropaths unable to communicate, psychers unable to use their abilities, the Chaos God's connection to the material universe disrupted across the whole of the galaxy in one stroke. And the third theory, the one that even Cryptman finds difficult to accept, is the most extraordinary of all. Some scholars suggest that the structure is not a beacon or a weapon, but an overwriter, that Tiamat is building a device capable of not just suppressing the warp, but of reaching into it and replacing the psychic substrate that currently exists there, the emotional residue of billions of sentient beings, the foundation of demonic existence, the medium through which the Chaos Gods draw power, with something alien, something from outside, a Tyranid psychic framework that operates on different principles entirely, whilst making the warp inhospitable to anything born of mortal emotion, claiming it for the hive mind instead. If that third theory is correct, what hive fleet Tiamat is building on Zeophoria is not just a weapon against chaos, it is a device to absorb the warp itself. Part 9. Could the Tyranids actually absorb a Chaos God? The title of this video raises a question that needs to be addressed directly, with the appropriate nuance and the appropriate distinction between what has happened in canon and what is theoretically possible within the rules of the setting. What has definitively happened? The Tyranids, specifically Hive Fleet Leviathan, fought the Quadrifold Abominatum, representatives of all four Chaos Gods simultaneously, and won. The shadow in the warp smothered demonic psychic abilities, denying them power at a critical moment. Whilst the Tyranids then consumed the world, incorporating whatever residual psychic energy the daemonic incursion left in the biomass of Shadowbrink into the swarm's reserves. The Chaos Gods did not lose any permanent power from this encounter. Shub-Luthgurg was banished, which is an inconvenience but not destruction for a greater demon. The other three withdrew, or were defeated. But no permanent diminishment of the Chaos Gods themselves occurred. What Hive Fleet Kronos has done, close small warp rifts through the concentrated application of the shadow in the warp. This is significant. A warp rift is a tear in the fabric of reality, a channel through which the immaterium bleeds into the material universe. Closing one requires asserting sufficient psychic pressure on the fabric of reality to force the tear closed. Whilst the fact that Kronos can do this, that the collective psychic mass of its organisms can reach sufficient density to heal a wound in reality by sheer alien weight, is new. Nothing else in the setting has accomplished this without enormous cost and specialized sorcerous effort. What Hive Fleet Tiamat may be building, unknown, but the theories suggest an escalation of what Kronos can do on a local scale to a potential galaxy-wide application. Now, could the Tyranids actually absorb a Chaos God, a full, major chaos deity, Khorn or Nurgle or Tzinch or Slanesh, in the sense of consuming it, incorporating it, ending its existence as an independent entity? The honest answer is that no, this has not happened in canon, and almost certainly cannot happen in the way one organism consumes another. Whilst a Chaos God is not a physical thing that can be bitten or dissolved or broken apart by biology, it is a psychic entity of near infinite mass, composed of the accumulated emotional energy of billions of sentient beings across thousands of years, dwelling in the warp where physical laws do not apply. You cannot eat something that exists as an abstract emotional resonance in a different dimension of existence, but there is a different way to think about absorption that the law supports. The Tyranids do not absorb by eating in every context. The shadow in the warp works by replacing, or perhaps more accurately, by occupying. The hive mind's psychic signal does not consume the warp's emotional resonance the way a Tyranid consumes biomass. It drowns it out. It crowds it out. Yet it asserts such a dense and overwhelming alien presence that the warp frequency the Chaos Gods need to operate is suppressed into inaudibility, the way a bright enough light can make it impossible to see anything else. What would happen if this effect was applied not locally, but globally? If Tiamat's resonator, assuming the third theory about its purpose is correct, was completed and activated, if the shadow in the warp was projected across the entire galaxy simultaneously at the intensity Kronos achieves in local engagements, the Chaos Gods would not be destroyed outright. They cannot be destroyed while the emotions that created them still exist. And as long as there are sentient beings in the galaxy capable of feeling rage, despair, ambition, or desire, Khorne, Nurgle, Tsinach, and Slaanesh will persist in some form. But their ability to act, to send demons into the material world, to corrupt their champions, to receive the prayers of their followers, and funnel power back through the connection, all of that depends on their connection to the material universe being intact. And that connection runs through the warp, specifically through those parts of the warp that resonate with mortal emotion. If the shadow in the warp at galaxy scale pushed the warp's emotional resonance out of frequency with the material universe, the Chaos Gods would not vanish, but they would become isolated, trapped in the warp, unable to reach out, unable to answer prayers, unable to send servants, unable to corrupt or tempt or destroy. They would still exist, still feel, still rage and scheme and revel in their particular obsessions. But they would be deaf and blind to the material universe, and the material universe would be correspondingly free of their touch. And then the hive mind would be free to eat everything in peace. This is not the same as absorbing a chaos god in the dramatic, literal sense of eating one. But it may be a more terrifying concept, not destroying the gods, not even fighting them exactly, rendering them irrelevant, cutting the signal, placing the material universe in a psychic dead zone where their power cannot reach, then consuming everything in it. There is another dimension to this that is worth exploring. The Tyranids have demonstrated repeatedly that they absorb genetic and psychic information from everything they consume. Every species they eat, they learn from. Every weapon they face, they adapt countermeasures to. With the hive mind's genetic library, accumulated across whatever number of galaxies it has consumed in its long history, may already contain the genetic material of creatures that had psychic resonances approaching something demon-like. If it has already eaten species whose psychic nature had similarities to the emotional constructs that form the basis of demonic entities, it may have already begun developing the biological tools to process and incorporate that kind of psychic substrate. The shadow in the warp growing stronger with each generation, each fleet, each new adaptation, the ability to close warp rifts emerging in Kronos when it was not present in previous fleets. These suggest a learning process. The hive mind is working out how to interact with warp energy in increasingly sophisticated ways. But not by understanding it the way a psyker understands it, not by wielding it the way a sorcerer wields it, but by slowly, patiently, biologically developing the capacity to metabolize it, to eat it. Part 10. The endgame. What happens to chaos if the Tyranids win? Let us think about the endgame. Not the immediate crisis, not the current battles being fought in M42, but the full scenario. What does the Milky Way look like if the Tyranids complete their work? And what does that mean for each of the Chaos Gods specifically? Slaanesh starves first. This is not speculation. It is implied very strongly by the nature of what Slaanesh feeds on. The Dark Prince draws power primarily from sensation, desire, pleasure, pain, and the specific kind of psychic excess that comes from beings desperately seeking experiences at the edge of what they can survive. This requires not just sentient beings, but sentient beings with a certain richness of interior experience, a certain density of desire, and self-consciousness that generates the particular emotional flavor Slaanesh craves most intensely. The Tyranids are the most profound possible negation of this. The hive mind does not desire anything in the way Slaanesh recognizes desire. The individual organisms do not experience the kind of sensation that feeds the Dark Prince. And as the hive mind consumes the species that do generate that experience, humans, Eldar, the sensation-seeking races of the galaxy, the supply of Slaanesh's particular food thins, the Eldar in particular, who are so deeply connected to Slaanesh's birth that their souls are essentially the Dark Prince's property, would be consumed by the Tyranids before they could die in ways that feed their ancient nemesis. The horror and the cruelty of the endgame is that the Tyranids would deny Slaanesh the feast of Eldar souls the Dark Prince has been waiting to claim, not through any benevolence toward the Eldar, but through the utterly cold indifference of eating them first. Nurgle's situation is more complex. The Lord of Decay draws power from death and disease, and the acceptance of inevitable entropy. In one sense, the Tyranid invasion is the greatest gift Nurgle has ever received. Billions dying in pain and despair across countless worlds, his power spiking enormously as the swarms hit. But this is temporary. Once the swarm has moved on, or once the world is stripped and silent, there is nothing left for Nurgle. The decay is complete. There is no ongoing rot, no slow dissolution of civilization, no generation of new death from existing life. Just rock, dead, silent, fungus-free, bacteria-free rock. Nurgle's garden cannot grow in a Tyranid-consumed galaxy because there is nothing left for his processes to work on. Horn has the most immediate problem. The blood god feeds on combat, on the spilling of blood, on the martial fury of warriors in battle. The Tyranids provide combat in extraordinary quantities. The wars, as the fleets consume the galaxy, would be among the bloodiest in history. But once the consumption is complete, once the last defending army is dissolved and the last city falls, there is nothing. No warriors left to fight, no blood to spill, no battle to rage over. The entire galaxy, emptied of life, is a direct assault on Khorne's power base. He is the god of war, and a dead galaxy has no war in it. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the god of scheming and hope and the endless fractal complexity of possibility, faces perhaps the most existential threat of all. Because Tzeentch does not just feed on emotion in the general sense. He feeds on the specific kind of psychic complexity that comes from minds reaching toward uncertain futures, planning and scheming and hoping and fearing about things that have not happened yet. He is the god of if. And the Tyranids are the absolute antithesis of if. The hive mind does not consider possibilities or form contingency plans or hope for outcomes. It processes the situation as it is and executes the optimal response. There is no uncertainty in the swarm's internal life, no hope, no ambition, no scheming. A galaxy consumed by Tyranids leaves Tzeentch with nothing to scheme with and nothing to scheme through. The impossibly complex web of destiny and fate and probability that constitutes his domain in the warp would thin and narrow as the minds generating that complexity were consumed. Tzeentch, who sees all possibilities, must see this coming. His schemes must, somewhere in their impossible depths, already contain the contingency of the Tyranid endgame. Whether Tzeentch has already made moves to address this, whether some of his plots are, in ways no one has quite understood yet, attempts to interfere with the hive mind's progress, is one of the great unanswered questions of the current law. The changer of ways is nothing if not prepared. But here is the core of it all. The Chaos Gods, for all their immense and terrible power, are reactive. They were created by the emotional output of other beings. They have no independent existence from the mortal creatures who feed them. They are, at the most fundamental level, dependent, utterly, existentially, irreversibly dependent on the continued emotional life of the galaxy. The hive mind is not. The hive mind existed before it found the Milky Way. It will exist after, whether that existence is here in a consumed Milky Way or out there in the void, between galaxies moving toward whatever the next meal is. The Tyranids do not need the galaxy to exist. They only want to consume it. This makes the Chaos Gods, for all their divine power, the dependent party in this confrontation. They need the Tyranids to lose. They need the galaxy to survive in a form that still generates emotional energy. They need humans and Eldar, and all the other screaming, suffering, hoping, loving, raging species to continue existing, because without them, the gods are fed nothing. The Tyranids need nothing from the Chaos Gods. They just need them out of the way. Part 11. Putting it all together. The biggest picture in the galaxy. Step back now and look at all of this from the widest possible angle. In the current era, M42, the era Indomitus, the age of the Great Rift, the galaxy is in a state of extraordinary crisis, unlike anything since the Horus Heresy 10,000 years ago. The Imperium is divided and strained, fighting on 100 fronts simultaneously. The Chaos Gods are more empowered than they have been since their great servants walked openly among humanity in the days of the traitor legions. Ancient species like the Necrons are awakening from their long slumber, looking at the chaos the younger races have made of their galaxy with the cold contempt of the extremely old and extremely patient. The Eldar are maneuvering in their veiled and desperate way, seeking paths through the probability maze that do not end in extinction. And underneath all of this, moving with the patient, unhurried certainty of a geological force, the Tyranids are consuming. What makes the Tyranid chaos conflict so fascinating is that it is not primarily a military conflict. Yes, there are battles. Shadowbrink happened. Kronos' engagements happen. The second Shadowbrink battle happened. Well, these are real confrontations with real consequences. But the larger competition between these two forces is not about who can win any given battle. It is about who gets to own the future state of the galaxy. The Chaos Gods, at their most fundamental level, are invested in the status quo continuing forever. They want the galaxy to remain populated, emotional, struggling, striving. They want the war to go on, the plagues to spread, the schemes to deepen, the excesses to intensify. They are the ultimate status quo power, even though they appear to be agents of destruction, because their power depends on nothing changing in ways that would make the galaxy emotionally empty. They cannot allow the Tyranids to succeed. The Tyranids are the ultimate change agent. They do not preserve any existing structure. They do not negotiate or compromise. But they do not want the galaxy in any particular state except digested. Every alliance, every civilization, every ancient tradition and carefully maintained institution that exists in the Milky Way, the Tyranids see none of it. They see only biomass in various stages of accessibility. What has begun to emerge, in the stories being told in the most recent editions of the lore, is the suggestion that the Hive mind is not simply eating its way toward the Chaos Gods by accident. The creation of Kronos, fleet specifically designed to counter chaos, suggests strategic planning. The existence of Tiamat's structure, a continent-scale psychic device that has been under construction for potentially thousands of years, suggests very long-term planning. The Hive mind is not surprised by chaos. It is not confused by it. What it has encountered psychic entities before, presumably, in the other galaxies it has consumed. And it is developing a solution. The Imperium, faced with both threats simultaneously, has been forced into the darkly comic position of occasionally benefiting from Tyranid chaos conflicts without being able to deliberately engineer them. Admiral Grosson, at the Wolf's Head Nebula, got the Chaos Fleet off his back when Kronos arrived, but he did not call Kronos there. The Inquisition's recommendation in Octarius, drawing both Tyranids and Orcs into a massive war of mutual consumption, was a similar accidental alignment of interests rather than any genuine alliance. You cannot ally with the Tyranids. You cannot negotiate with the Hive mind. What you cannot make a deal, or a treaty, or a strategic compact with something that does not recognize you as anything other than future food. Occasionally, Tyranid and Chaos forces destroy each other, and everyone else benefits in the short term. But there is no long-term benefit to anyone, from any faction, if either force wins decisively. An Imperium where Chaos has consumed everything is hell. An Imperium where the Tyranids have consumed everything is nothing at all. The only possible future in which the galaxy survives is one where both of these forces are stopped, or at minimum slowed, by the combined effort of every other intelligent species choosing survival over their other conflicts. The Eldar know this. The Necrons know this. The Tau know this in a smaller way. Even some of the more far-sighted of mankind's servants understand it. While in the way people understand things, they are not supposed to publicly admit. But understanding it and doing something about it are very different problems. And the clock is running. Kronos moves along the Great Rift, clearing world after world, growing as it feeds. Its shadow growing stronger with each generation of organisms it spawns. Tiamat sits on Zeophoria, building something enormous, the continent-spanning structure pulsing with more power than it had the year before, fed by the pilgrimages of its converts, defended by organisms that shrug off firepower that would destroy any other Tyranid creature. The hive mind, vast and cold and patient, processes the strategic situation of the galaxy with the same unhurried efficiency it processes everything else. It knows about chaos. It has been learning about chaos for some time now. And it is building tools. The question that the law has not yet answered, and perhaps cannot answer within its own framework, is what happens when the tools are complete, when Tiamat's resonator finishes, when Kronos has cleared enough chaos-corrupted territory to reconnect the separated tendrils of the Leviathan's severed threads, when the hive mind has fully processed what it learned at Shadowbrink, at the Wolf's Head Nebula, at all the other engagements where its organisms pressed against the servants of the ruinous powers and adapted to everything they encountered. Will the shadow in the warp reach out from Zeophoria and cover the galaxy? Will the Chaos Gods find themselves suddenly cut off, their connection to the material universe severed by a psychic frequency they cannot process? Will the Eye of Terror grow silent, and the demons dissolving, and the corrupted worlds going cold and empty? And if that happens, if the Tyranids win that particular battle against chaos, what then? What does the galaxy look like when its greatest supernatural evil has been rendered irrelevant, and the thing that rendered it irrelevant is standing there with the appetite that drove it across the intergalactic void for hundreds of thousands of years, looking at everything that remains and seeing only food? These are the questions that the lore has seeded into the setting like depth charges, waiting for a player to notice them, waiting for the narrative to decide how deep the water goes. And the answer, if there is one, is probably not one any surviving inhabitant of the galaxy would find particularly comforting. Akita Part 12, Final Thoughts. What the story of the Tyranids and the Chaos Gods really is, when you pull back far enough to see the whole shape of it, is a story about incompatible needs colliding in the same finite space. Two forces that cannot coexist, that both need the galaxy but cannot both have it, circling each other in a conflict that neither fully understands. The Chaos Gods are old and powerful and terrible, but they are bound by their own nature, by their dependence on the emotional life of mortal beings, by the fact that for all their cosmic power, they are ultimately still defined by humanity and the other species that created them. They are mirrors, terrifying, destructive, utterly alien-feeling mirrors, but mirrors nonetheless. The Tyranids are something else, something that came from outside, whereas something that was old before the Milky Way had psychers to dream the Chaos Gods into being, something that does not reflect what is inside us because it is not from us and does not care about us in any way that would produce reflection. The hive mind is perhaps the one entity in the 40,000 setting that the Chaos Gods genuinely cannot understand on their own terms. They can corrupt anything that feels. The hive mind does not feel, not in any way that corresponds to their architecture. And it is, slowly, learning to eat them. The fall of Shadowbrink is important, not because the Tyranids won a battle against 4 greater demons. Plenty of armies have won battles against greater demons. It is important because of what the win demonstrated about how these forces interact, about the mechanics of the confrontation, or it's about the specific ways the hive mind's nature makes it capable of doing things to chaos that nothing else in the galaxy can do. The shadow closing around Shub-Luthgug's psychic reach, the zoanthropes finding him helpless, the organic artillery adapting in real time. None of that would work against an enemy the Tyranids are capable of fearing. Fear would have disrupted the cold calculus that made it possible, and the existence of Kronos, of Tiamat, of the second Shadowbrink battle, all tell the same story from different angles. The hive mind noticed. The hive mind learned. The hive mind is building a response. And unlike every other force in the galaxy that has tried to address the problem of chaos, tried and spent 10,000 years and trillions of lives trying, the hive mind is not trying to defeat chaos out of righteous purpose or ideological commitment or the burning faith of the faithful. It just wants to clear the contamination so it can eat. There is something almost funny about that, in the darkest possible way. All of human history in the 41st millennium, all the prayers and the sacrifices and the space marines and the crusades and the Inquisition, all of it thrown against chaos with mixed results. And then something arrives from outside the galaxy that cannot be corrupted, does not worship, does not feel, and simply starts pressing on the problem from a direction chaos has no answer for. In the grim darkness of the far future, as there is only war, but sometimes the most terrifying thing in the war is not the side that's screaming. Sometimes it is the side that is completely, utterly, permanently silent. Thank you so much for watching all the way through this one. If you found this lore dive interesting, if the idea of the hive mind slowly developing the tools to neutralize the chaos gods is the kind of content you want more of, then please leave a like on the video. It genuinely helps more people find the channel and helps me understand what you want to see more of. If you are new here and this is your first time watching Q on 40K, welcome, and please consider subscribing. There is a lot more like this waiting for you, delivered in the same relaxed, story-focused style you've been listening to for the past while. Warhammer 40,000 has stories in it that you cannot find anywhere else. The scale of it, the depth of it, the way the pieces fit together when you look at them from the right angle. There is nothing quite like it in fiction. I love sharing these corners of the setting, and I'm glad you are here to hear them. Until next time, take care of yourselves.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.